Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Tate. I'm the general manager with the Southern Georgian Bay Chamber of Commerce, and we'd like to thank you on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce and the Severn Sound Environmental Association for joining us tonight for this very interesting webinar on invasive species. So in case you're not familiar with them, the Severn Sound Environmental Association, also known as SSEA, you again, and Tamara, go ahead.
Thanks for that introduction, Kathy, and thank you so much for hosting this webinar for us tonight. So as Kathy said, I'm Tamara Brinkat, the Invasive Species Program Coordinator, and this evening I have here with me Cameron Epp, who is our invasive species technician. He will be presenting a little bit tonight. I have Michelle Huddlin, who is our wetlands and habitat biologist. She will be moderating the questions tonight. And I have Nicole Stott, who is also another invasive species technician joining us tonight. So before we get started into invasive species, I do have a poll to share. So I'll get Kathy to share our first poll here. So we're just interested in knowing where you're joining from this evening. So we've listed a couple different municipalities, and if you don't fall into that category, that's okay. You can choose the other option, but it's just nice for us to know where everyone's joining from this evening. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to get your answers in, and then we can share the results. All right, Kathy, do you want to end the poll and share the results? All right, so a nice mix up here. That's great. And then we have another poll just to kind of, for us to understand where you're at with respect to invasive species. So Kathy, if you could share the second poll, please. All right, so our second question here is, what would you say your current knowledge level is with respect to invasive species? So we have beginner, intermediate, expert, or maybe you're unsure at this point, and you'll kind of get some knowledge tonight and decide. I've also seen a couple people in the chat say that the recording has stopped. So Kathy, you might want to check to see if the recording is actually going right now.
It sure is,
Okay.
Tamara. Thank you.
All right, we're good then. So we'll give you a few more seconds to get your answers in. And then Kathy, if you could share the results on that. All right, so we have lots of beginners, so that's great. That's probably why you're here this evening. And I'm sure that we have some stuff to share with you, and I'm sure you'll learn something. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about who is SSEA to start off with. So who is the Severn Sound Environmental Association? And then we're going to dive right into an introduction to invasive species and go over some of the more common and unique species that we can find in the Severn Sound area. Then we're going to talk about what you can do to help fight against invasive species. So the last portion of the presentation will be about preventing and reporting and resources that are available to you. So to start off here, a quick outline of who SSEA is. We're a partnership between 8 municipalities, the ones that are listed on the slide there. And all of those are found within the Severn Sound watershed area. Our organization is supported by federal and provincial governments, as well as other partner agencies. The Severn Sound Environmental Association, or SSEA, was established in 1997, but our roots date back to the formation of the Severn Sound Remedial Action Plan in the late 1980s. We've been a joint municipal service board since 2009, and our main focus is water quality. So both surface water of lakes and rivers and groundwater, but also we have a variety of other projects and programs. Our focus is to keep water clean so that it supports healthy and terrestrial aquatic ecosystems. So on the slide here is a map of the Severn Sound watershed area. So this is the area that we work in, and it includes all open water that's of the Severn Sound, and also it includes a group of bays all the way from Matchindash in the east to Penetanguishene Bay in the west, and as far north as Honey Harbor and Beausoleil Island. It also includes the land base and river systems that drain into Severn Sound. So the reason that we're here tonight is our invasive species program. So through the invasive species program, we reduce the ecological, economic, and social impacts of invasive species in the Severn Sound watershed area. And we mainly do this through 4 key actions. So that's prevention, monitoring, management, and education. Now, diving right into invasive species, here we have a slide that's what is invasive species. So this term is kind of thrown around a lot, but I know that some of you may not be familiar what it actually means. So an invasive species is really any organism that's established outside of its historical range, but it also has to cause some sort of harm to the surrounding community. So it can be environmental harm, economic harm, such as to our forestry industry or the agricultural industry. It can be harming society or human health. And we often see that invasive species will have rapid growth or reproduction, and they usually lack natural controls in their new environment. So for example, a lack of natural predators. I'll ask Kathy at this point to launch our next poll because it is a question about invasive species. All right, so based on number of species, which group do you think makes up the largest percent of invasive species in Ontario? So in other words, which of these groups listed here do you think contains the most invasive species, so the most different types of species? I'll give you about 20 seconds or so to get your responses in. And Kathy, if you want to end the poll and then share the results. All right, so fish, plants, insects, no one for invertebrates, and we have an other category. So I'll give you the answer on this next slide. All right, so there are 75 different invasive species identified in the Severn Sound watershed area, and most of those are actually plants. So most of you are right in saying that. Some of the other categories that we see are fish, insects, invertebrates. And then in that other category, we have things like algae, wildlife, which could be mammals or reptiles, and we also see microorganisms, which are those tiny little pathogens that affect plants. The map on the slide here shows a bunch of red dots. So each of those red dots represents a different invasive species sightings by the Severn Sound Environmental Association. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've kind of divided different species into 2 categories. One of those is the water category, so that's aquatic or wetland species, and then the other is terrestrial or land species. So the water species include things like fish or invertebrates such as zebra mussels, and it can also include plants that we find in wetlands, but also those that are submerged underwater. In the terrestrial category, we mainly have plants, but there's also some insects as well. Another thing that I'll go over is the difference between noxious and invasive, because sometimes these get confused for one another. So noxious really means a threat to agriculture and public health. These don't necessarily have to be invasive, but there is some overlap. So there are some invasive species that are also considered noxious, but it's not necessarily the case that all invasive species are noxious. And there is also some native species that are considered noxious, like poison ivy. So any of those noxious species are regulated under the Weed Control Act, whereas invasive species are regulated under the Invasive Species Act. So one of the things I want to highlight is how invasive species get around. So they can get around by natural movement. So you know, seeds and eggs can be distributed by wind, water, or carried by animals, even on their fur or paws. But most of the spread of invasive species is actually human related. So a lot of those are what we call hitchhikers on vehicles or clothing or through other means. So we often see, you know, dirt on our shoes or clothing that are carrying seeds or carrying eggs that we may not even be able to see with the bare eye. Other ways that invasive species can be spread are through contaminated fill or shipping material. And then we also see them kind of used intentionally and released. So a lot of ornamental or garden species have the potential to be invasive species, even if they're not necessarily a known invasive species. Something that might be not native to this area and used in a garden has the potential to spread. A really good example of that is one of the more common species, Phragmites, which was originally brought to this area as an ornamental species. And then there's also aquarium species, such as fish, or there's a species of turtle that's invasive. So oftentimes when people don't want these species anymore, they'll get dumped into natural areas. And again, they have the potential to become invasive. So before we dive into identification of some specific species, I want to point out a couple notes here. So one of the things is that when you're going to identify an invasive species, the appearance can really vary. So it depends on a lot of things. It can depend on seasonality or habitat and even growth stage. So a really good example of this is garlic mustard, which is the photos that you see there. So in year one, garlic mustard has these basal rosette leaves that have the scalloped edges, so they're quite low to the ground, and you can see in that first picture there. And then in the picture on the right-hand side, that's year two. So that's when you'll see a stem start to shoot up, and then the leaves are more a triangular shape, and they're quite toothed, and they have these white flowers. So from year one to year two, the species looks quite different. And this is a good general rule of thumb when you're going to identify any species, not just necessarily invasive species, but check for multiple features. So for example, on plants, look at the flowers, leaves, and stem, and look at those multiple features to help you. And then kind of your last resort is to confirm identification with an application or with SSEA. So if you're unsure and you think you might come across an invasive species, you can always confirm the identification by getting in contact with myself, or you can use applications such as iNaturalist or EdMaps, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. All right, so now we're going to get into some specific species. Because of time constraints, we don't have time to go over every single invasive species. Of course, there's over 70, right? So we're going to talk about some of the more common ones that you'll see in the Severn Sound area. And then we also are going to talk about some of the more unique ones later on. So the first species that I'll talk about here is the LDD moth. And this has kind of been a hot topic in the past couple of years. It's a pest that probably many of you recognize, and it's a growing concern because its tendency to defoliate trees, and it can really be a nuisance. So the LDD moth is a terrestrial insect. As I said, this insect will feed on trees, and it defoliates them. So that means it chews through the vegetation. One individual caterpillar can actually chew through over a square meter leaves in its time. And right now, this species is in its caterpillar stage. So you'll notice that there's these black little fuzzy caterpillars that are crawling around on trees or even on decks. And that's actually this LDD moth. Oh, another thing I wanted to point out too is the other name for this species is gypsy moth, and that's been commonly used. It is considered an insensitive name to say gypsy moth, so we're moving towards the term LDD moth. There's a number of controls you can use for this species, and I've listed a couple of them here. So a few of them are hand picking or scraping them into soapy water. And then other options, especially during the caterpillar stage, is to shade trap or use insecticide. And then more natural control is just to allow for tree care. So making sure that your tree is healthy so some of those natural defenses can defend against them. We do have a lot of information on our website about this. So we have a fact sheet and some videos that will tell you more information, but we don't have time to get into too much detail about it today. The next species I'll talk about here is the emerald ash borer, which is another insect. So this insect is regulated by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. It affects specifically ash trees, and you may notice if you have an ash tree, you may notice some of those S-shaped lines under the bark, like you see in the picture there, or you may notice some bark peeling or falling off or chipping, and you may even notice some of those holes in the photo there. So these are all signs of emerald ash borer, and unfortunately, when we start to see these severe symptoms, it's too late to manage this species. So really keep a close eye if you do have ash trees, because one of the controls, which is a pesticide, can only work if you're early enough in catching the infestation. One of the ways to prevent this species is to avoid moving firewood. So for many invasive insects or forest pests, moving firewood can just facilitate them to spread to new areas. So it's the whole concept of burn where you buy. The next species that I'll talk about is the round goby, which is an invasive fish. So the round goby is regulated under the Fisheries Act, and it is actually illegal to possess, transport, and release in Ontario. We've seen the round goby in certain areas of the Severn Sound watershed. So we've seen it specifically in open water in Georgian Bay as well as Midland Bay. As far as prevention for this species, I'll emphasize that clean, drain, dry protocol, which I'll talk about more in detail later, is really how you prevent this species. So making sure to clean and dry your boat before transferring it to different water. If you're fishing and you do catch this species, we recommend that you humanely euthanize it and dispose of it away from water. One of the more common species that you're probably already heard of is zebra and quagga mussels, which are two different species of invasive mussels. So these ones are regulated under the Canadian Fisheries Act, and it's illegal to import them into Ontario. They really affect lakes and rivers and beaches. So oftentimes they'll be hidden along the shoreline, and people step on them, and because they have quite sharp shells, they will cut your feet, so it can be dangerous. As far as prevention for this species, I'll emphasize again that clean, drain, dry protocol is really how we prevent them from moving to new areas. And one thing that I wanted to highlight about this species specifically is they were recently found on something called mothballs, which is an aquarium plant, not relevant to zebra mussels, but because they're so small, I guess they slipped through some of the legislation and processes that are to importing materials. So anyways, these species were found on mothballs, so it just highlights, you know, not to dump aquarium species or aquarium plants into natural areas because they can contain species like this. Even if it is a native species, there's possibility that there's an invasive species attached. The next species I'll highlight is giant hogweed. So this one is one of those plants that's considered noxious, and it's also considered an invasive species. So this one is, it contains a phototoxic sap. So what that means is if you were to touch the species and then if you had sunlight on your skin, it's going to react with the sap from the plant, and it will burn your skin, and it can cause blistering and rashes. So I'll emphasize here that if you do see this species, that you wear proper protection and avoid touching it when possible. The best way to control this species is either herbicides or hand removal. So herbicides can only be applied by a licensed professional, and then hand removal, again, you would have to wear proper protective equipment, and hand removal has to happen when it's in its stage where it's only leaves. It can't happen after it's flowered already. In Severn Sound, we've observed it along the Utah Trail in Severn. So another species that is pretty common around the Severn Sound area is Phragmites, or common reed. So this one you'll see all across the 400 on ditches and roadsides, and it's often found on shorelines too. So this one is an aquatic plant, and it's known as a restricted species under the Invasive Species Act. So it's one of those species that it's illegal to import, release, grow, buy, or sell. And there's a couple different management options for this one. So what I'll point out is with this species and with other invasive species, usually an integrated approach of a couple different management options works best. And Phragmites is a really great example of this. So since Phragmites can kind of grow in aquatic stands and it also grows on land, there's a number of different management options that can be used. So the cut to drown method, so basically what that's referring to is if you have a stand of plants that's partially underwater, you want to cut that plant underwater because it helps to drown out the root system. And then if you have a stand, say on your property that's more terrestrial or land-based, there's a couple different options. So manual spading, which is essentially severing the roots under the ground, or seed head removal, or herbicide can be applied. And this one, like I said, that we see all around Severn Sound. So silvergrass or miscanthus is often confused with Phragmites, so I thought I would kind of highlight it here. So they do look visually similar, but there's a few differences that help you tell them apart. So Phragmites will often grow in open water areas, whereas we don't really see miscanthus in open water. We do see it on ditches and roadsides, but we don't see it in open water areas. And I'll highlight too, both are actually invasive species. As far as the seed head, so miscanthus, or the name silvergrass, gets the name because of the seed head. So the seed head in the late fall or winter is white or silver, whereas the Phragmites will be tan. And this one is a really great example of how a garden species has escaped and it affects certain areas and becomes invasive. So this is a species that's still available to buy at garden centers and nurseries, but it is an invasive species. And then we have garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is a terrestrial plant. We see it along roadsides or trails and often in forest understories. This one outcompetes native vegetation, especially trilliums for resources. And it is something called allelopathic. So that means that its roots secrete a chemical that inhibits the growth of other plants. The control for this one is hand pulling and clipping flower heads for one of the controls listed here, mowing or cutting. So I just want to highlight that because one of the things with invasive species, sometimes mowing and cutting can actually promote the growth of them. So if you mow it, it doesn't get rid of its energy stores per se, the underground system. So it can actually promote more growth. It's often used in conjunction with other management techniques. And sometimes if a species is seeding, that mowing can actually help to spread the seeds or the plant parts. So just be careful with that one. And then we do see this species kind of all over Severn Sound. So I'm going to pass it over to Cameron now. He's going to talk about a couple different species. So he's going to talk about the two mystery snail species as well as butternut canker.
All right. So for the mystery snails in Severn Sound, we have the Chinese and banded mystery snails, which were both introduced intentionally to North America as pets and as a food source. And now they spread accidentally through the movement of boats and other watercraft and equipment. They're used by some people in aquariums and aqua gardens. And originally they were used as a food source and brought over for migrant workers to farm. Nowadays, dumping them from aquariums has helped them spread into other states and provinces in North America. And it's really important, once again, the prevention on this one, because this is another species that can spread very easily through the movement of boats and other equipment from lake to lake. Their biology allows them to spread quickly because they have a trap door called an operculum on their shells, which can be sealed off so they do not dry out while they're on land. So if they're stuck to a boat or if they're in your live well, they'll actually survive for 4 or 5 days out of water as you travel between water bodies. They are larger than our native snails and can easily outcompete them for food and other resources. Because of their size, they're actually large enough to clog the water intake pipes in cottages, private houses, and even municipal water plants at times. They've also been known to carry parasites, which can have an effect on humans, can make people sick, nothing too serious, but it can give people a stomach flu. The main control methods for invasive mystery snails is the clean, drain, and dry procedures again, using hot pressurized water to wash your boats and trailers or leaving them out in the sun to dry for up to at least 5 days. You can always report sightings, and if you do collect any of these invasive snails, it's recommended to tightly bag them and freeze them for at least 24 hours before discarding them in the trash. So this is the Chinese mystery snail, which is pretty easy to identify compared to a native snail or banded mystery snail because of its size. The adults are going to be upwards of 2.5 inches or 6.5 centimeters long. They do have a solid brownish to greenish colored shell, and they have 7 to 8 whorls seen around the shell. For the banded mystery snail, they're going to be a little bit smaller. So they're going to be around 1.5 inches long or 3.5 centimeters. And the main identifying feature between them and a Chinese mystery snail is going to be the brownish reddish bands on the shell that's going to follow the spirals up the sides of the shell. And that is all for our mystery snails. Now for butternut canker, the butternut canker is a forest pathogen that was introduced to Ontario by unknown pathways. It's likely thought to spread from state to state and province to province using hitchhiking on imported wood products that are made from trees that were infected. This is a fungus that is identifiable by these black marks seen on the bark of the butternut trees. The trees will actually try and grow over the wounds that are the fungus has entered, which makes it hard to see it sometimes on an infected tree, except for these black marks kind of sticking out of the bark. Naturally, the spores of the fungus are spread by bugs, rain, and wind, but humans can also spread them great distances by moving firewood and wood products to new areas, as well as live trees. To control and prevent this butternut canker from spreading, the best thing to do is to just buy local firewood and local trees from your nurseries. The butternut is now an endangered species because of the effect that this pathogen has had on it, since there is no way of preventing it from killing the tree once it has taken hold. There's no treatments for it. There are some nurseries that are offering live butternuts for sale, but it's best to buy those locally if you're wanting to plant some in your yard. And I'll hand it back over to Tamara now.
Thanks, Cam. So I'm going to move on to some of the more unique invaders. So these ones are maybe not as commonly known, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not as widespread in the Severn Sound area. So the first one that I'm going to point out is a species called Starry Stonewort. So this is one of those species that's an aquatic macroalgae. So it's kind of considered in that other category that I talked about earlier. So it's not a plant, but it does grow like one. So it grows underwater. So it creates these dense mats of a plant-like material underwater. And it makes it difficult for people to swim or use the water. And we have observed this in some areas of the Severn Sound watershed. So we've seen it in Midland Bay, Penetanguishene Harbor, and Honey Harbor. And the reason that it gets its name, Starry Stonewort, is because of these star-like structures right here. So I like to think of these star structures as kind of anchors or roots. So if it were a plant, these would be the roots that would root it into the soil. So these anchor it into the sediment underwater. And, you know, as with some of the other aquatic invasive species that we talked about, some of the best method for that is to clean, drain, dry to prevent the spread. The next one that I'll talk about is the sea lamprey, which is one that actually got a lot of attention on the Southern Georgian Bay Chamber of Commerce social media. So this one is, it's a scary looking species, and I kind of like to think of it as a vampire. So it uses its teeth to latch onto fish, and it sucks the blood of fish. It's been around in North America since the 1800s, so quite a while. And there's been some concern around people thinking that they're going to get bit by these fish, and they don't typically attack humans. I haven't really heard any incidents of this happening, but they do feed on other fish. We have observed them in the Severn Sound open water areas, and they're pretty common in the Great Lakes region. Another one that is receiving quite a bit of attention in Ontario lately is wild pigs. So this one is kind of a growing problem, and we have had some sightings in our area, in the Moonstone and Wyville area. Both of these sightings were actually domestic escapees. So in this case, domestic escapees would also be considered a wild pig. So not only just wild boars are considered this invasive species, but these ones as well. And the reason for that is because they reproduce so quickly. and they have the potential to damage native species and compete with native wildlife. I'll highlight that if you do observe this species or participate in the reporting program that's going on, make sure to photograph and note your location and then get in contact with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters or the Ministry of Natural Resources. And I've listed their contact information on the slide there. If you do see a species that's escaped or a wild boar, one thing that I'll point out is not to hunt the species. So the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters is telling people not to hunt them because it's proven to scatter them, and then it encourages them to spread to other areas and form new populations. So really the only way to eliminate wild pigs is to track the individuals to their groups and then remove all members of that group at the same time. Another one that I want to highlight, which is kind of unique, is something called the red-eared slider, which is a turtle species. So this is another great example of a pet species that's been released into the wild and become an invasive species. So this one is known to outcompete native turtle species, and it also, there's been some research on it that it may transmit pathogens to other native turtles. And many of our native turtles are actually endangered species, so this is quite concerning. And this really highlights the importance of not dumping aquarium species. So now I'll jump into how you can fight back against invasive species. So there was a couple prevention methods that we kind of mentioned throughout the specific species, but I'll reiterate those in kind of a list. So one of the first things you can do is learn how to identify some of the common invasive species and report your sightings. So I listed some of them in this presentation here today, but there's quite a bit more. So there's a number of resources that I'll provide in a few slides that can help you with this. One of the things we talk about is preventing spread of invasive species from one area to another. So cleaning off or brushing off your footwear, clothing, and pet before you go from one area to another. So what I like to do is just carry a handheld brush and brush off my boots before leaving an area. You can also clean equipment, vehicles, and machinery. So this could be heavy machinery or even something as small as shovels if you're working in an area and moving the equipment off site. If you're gardening or landscaping, choose a native species. And I do understand that there's some cases where people use non-native species for ornamental purposes. But if you are going to use non-native species in your garden, just make sure to monitor them and don't release them into the wild. So if you're going to dispose of these species, just make sure to just not dump them in natural areas. Make sure to dry them out and dispose of them properly or burn where you're permitted by your municipality. And the one other one we mentioned quite a bit was the clean, drain, dry. So when you're moving equipment or watercraft from one area to another, you just want to make sure you're cleaning it off with pressurized water, draining all of that out, and then drying and making sure when you're moving it, there's no plants or mud left over, because that can hold invasive species. And then if you do have invasive species on your property, work to manage those invasive species and responsibly dispose of them. So there's a number of resources available online to help provide with best management practices in order to do those. If you do recognize an invasive species or you suspect that something might be an invasive species, I encourage you to report it to me. So I've provided my contact information there, and I'm always happy to help identify a species or help with best management practices and provide resources. If the sighting is not local, I would suggest submitting the sightings online to EDMAPS or iNaturalist. So EDMAPS is a way of citizen science reporting for invasive species. So you can provide location and species information, and it'll document it. iNaturalist is another method you can use, but that one is for all species, so it's not necessarily just invasive species. And if you upload a photo, you can actually get help with identification on that. And both have websites or phone applications. Alternatively, if you don't see something in the Severn Sound area, you can always call the toll-free invading species hotline, and the number is listed there. If you are planning on reporting to SSEA, getting in contact with me, there's a couple things specifically that we look for. So provide the suspected species name, so common or scientific is fine. If you can give a general idea of the infested area, so if, say, 10 meters squared of Phragmites plants, and just a rough estimate is fine. And then in addition to that, if you can estimate the number of plants or individuals, so in the case of Phragmites, say you have an infested area of 10 meters squared, and then you noticed 5 plants within that area. Or if it's something like a mystery snail, just estimate the number of individuals. You can also provide location. So I don't expect you to give me your exact address if it's on private property, but a general location is fine. And then if possible, photos are a great way to help ID species. So taking a photo of the infested area or taking up close-up identification photos of plant parts or something similar. If you are going to touch the species, make sure to wear gloves, or as some of them can be irritating or toxic or even carry disease. And then lastly, this one I'm pretty guilty of not doing. So if you're taking a photo of an invasive species, try to put something in the photo for size comparison. It just helps to identify certain features. And another thing I've included here is kind of a plug for our invasive species citizen science program. So this is a completely volunteer program where you can report invasive species sightings to us. So we're working on a more general approach to reporting all invasive species, but we have 2 target species now. One is the LDD moth, because we're in that kind of outbreak phase of it right now. And the other one is that species that I mentioned before, which is Starry Stonewort. And again, there's more information on our website. So here's just a list of resources. So on the SSEA website, we do have an invasive species page with a list of a number of different invasive species. We also have links to our fact sheets and videos. And then we do informative social media posts as well. I've also included some of the provincial invasive species pages, as well as the federal ones, and then the links to those applications that I was referring to. And we can follow up with the attendees and provide these resources after. So on that note, I will open it up to any questions. And then I have a final poll to ask you afterwards. And then if there is a specific species that you're interested in that we didn't talk about today, or maybe we just brushed on today, you're always welcome to ask me questions either today or afterwards. You can follow up. And if we don't have an answer today, we can always follow up with you later.
That's great. Thank you, Tamara. I'm going to be trying to moderate some of these questions. There's been a few questions coming in through the session. Kathy, could we please stop recording stop the recording for the question and answer? It just might make people